Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 14 of The Silver Chair, The Bottom of the World.
We get to know some gnomes a little bit better. There's some chasms. This is a good chapter.
Know some gnomes. I was thinking maybe you were going to have a Johnny Cash reference here, but...
And they keep going down, 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 but the flames go higher.
Yeah, exactly.
It works pretty well.
What's the name? Is that Ring of Fire? Is that the name of the song?
Yes.
I only have like a Johnny Cash like greatest hit, so that was like what I mostly interacted with him with in my my younger years. Still like Johnny Cash, but I don't know of. And that's not true. We have Folsom Prison Blues on vinyl downstairs. We got the old record.
Oh, nice.
That's a really, really great record.
That is a great record. I love. You can hear everybody in the background. I love that.
Well, Phil, what do we have today? What's going on in chapter 14?
Well, I'll get to my summary in just a moment, but we do get to meet Golg, and we get a little bit of what was going on outside while they were kind of getting out of where the scramble took place. Yeah.
Well, before we jump into chapter 14, I want to go way back to, I think it was our second episode ever. Can you travel back with me for a second?
Okay.
In that episode, it's either episode 2 or 3, we mentioned Professor J.R.R. Tolkien and his relationship to the Chronicles of Narnia. And we've mentioned this many times since then, but it's when we first talked about the fact that, according to kind of popular belief, he really disliked the Chronicles of Narnia, especially the way that Lewis borrowed from a lot of different mythologies. Well, recently, I listened to an episode of Speaking with Joy, which is a podcast that I'll link in the description below, but I think we've also mentioned it once or twice here on the Lamppost Listener. And Joy Clarkson had a guest, an author named Holly Ordway on the show, and she has a book coming out in 2021 called Tolkien's Modern Reading, which is a book that's focusing on a lot of the modern literature that Tolkien read. A lot of times he gets this reputation as this kind of stuffy guy who's only reading really old books, and he did like a lot of ancient and medieval literature, but he liked a lot of modern things as well. But in that, and one, just I think on its own, I think a lot of our listeners would be interested in what Holly Ordway has to say about Tolkien. But in particular, she mentioned, she talked about some of Tolkien's thoughts on the Chronicles of Narnia. And I don't want to spoil it because I want listeners to go over and listen to it. But she did say that a lot of what we believe about Tolkien's thoughts on the Chronicles of Narnia might be a little bit of hearsay. And it might have been exaggerated a bit. And that his views on the Chronicles probably were not as negative as they often are claimed to be.
So I would guess not as clear cut either.
Exactly. I mean, Joy Clarkson and Holly Ordway talked about, in particular, kind of some of his thoughts on Mr. Tumnus and maybe some of the joking that he was doing with friends like Roger Lancelin Green, who we mentioned a couple episodes ago. That some of that kind of joking and kind of teasing friends back and forth might have been taken to be more serious than it ever was intended to be. So I highly recommend going and checking out that episode, which will be in the description for this episode. So just wanted to mention that before we jump into chapter 14.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, in the last chapter, what happened?
Last chapter was this respite from a battle that had just taken place. They defeated the Lady of the Green Kirtle, who was in snake form. And the chapter is really them kind of making their way out of that room and then all the way up to meeting this gnome that Puddleglum had grabbed off the street.
Yeah, and that leads us right into chapter 14. So do you want to take it away, man?
Yeah. Golg the gnome introduces himself and tells Puddleglum, Rillian, and the children that he is from an even deeper land called Bism. They had all been enchanted by the witch and mistakenly thought they were enemies. The prince then asks for the way to the diggings near the surface of the earth, but before they part ways, Golg invites them to Bism. This appeals to the prince, who would love the legacy of a trip to the depths of the earth, but they decline and quickly say farewell as the gnomes dive into the chasm that will lead them home. Left alone in the underworld, the group turns toward the road lit by lamps and resume their journey. As the roof lowers and the lights slowly blink out, the four of them are left at a dead end with a glimmer of blue light above them.
Very nice. Phil, we were not super hot on the last chapter. We didn't dislike it, but we both kind of agreed that it was a little bit slower after the kind of multiple chapters of build-up to the confrontation with the Lady of the Green Kirtle. How are you feeling about this chapter?
It has some similarities to the last one. It seems like we're still waiting to get to the action, but I feel like the exposition is worth the trade-off.
Okay.
We learn a little bit more about what was going on. It's similar to other stories where you have this main event happen, but then later on you have a connection to, like, you'll hear something from the other scene, and you're now getting to hear like the background. This just happened for me in The Lord of the Rings. They connected something with a specific time point in the battle that was being held elsewhere.
Give me some details.
Frodo and Sam are talking, and then they hear this like blood-curdling scream from very far away. And it was when the is it Pippin that stabs the creature?
You're talking about the Witch King of Angmar?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, well, Eowyn's the one who defeats the Witch King.
But Pippin stabs the... Is it a...
I thought it was Merry, but...
Yeah, it could be. I can't tell them apart.
Pippin is part of the Guard of the Citadel, so he's in Minas Tirith. I don't believe he's on Pelennor Fields.
So it is Merry who stabs him?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe so, because he's the one who's riding with the Rohirrim. Both him and Eowyn aren't really supposed to be there, and yet there they both are.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
But just like I was just reading that the other night, and it's fun to see how they're kind of connecting the time points a little bit, or explaining what was going on, even though it's not happening at exactly the same time. They're saying what was happening.
Sure. Yeah, I'm in agreement that this is more like our last chapter. And, when we had Father Dan on a couple episodes ago, and we all three of us were in agreement that the confrontation with the Emerald Witch, if you will, was kind of the climax of the book. And again, we have 2 more chapters to go, so maybe I'll change my mind here. But I do still think that holds true. And in some ways, that's a good thing, right? I think I mentioned that, the real battle is the battle for their faith. And so everything else after that is more of a formality than it is anything else. It's more of, as a reader, I'm not thinking, oh my goodness, will they ever get out of this place and get back to Narnia? That question isn't the question I'm asking as a reader. Instead, I'm asking, how are they going to do that? Once they've defeated, the big bad for the book, I know that things are probably going to end well for our companions, for our heroes here. The question is just, how will they end?
Right.
Is that how you felt?
It's interesting when you can read a book and you know how much is left, because it's a physical thing, and you know that there's a certain number of pages left, and knowing that there are 7 books total, it does give you a little bit more of a calm approach to reading stuff, where you're like, I'm not afraid that certain characters are not going to be able to make it out. I am curious how they're going to make it out. And sure. I love that, we'll see later on in this chapter, the road that they're on, the roof is getting lower and lower and lower, and then they hit a dead end. And it's just kind of fun to have this confidence that things are going to work out, but we're not exactly sure how they're going to work out.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and jump into this chapter. It starts right off with, "My name is Golg." We jump right into the introduction of this character. What are your thoughts on Golg? How are you feeling about this guy?
He seems nice enough, and he is willing to provide some clarity and explain their actions, which is great because we thought they were about to be attacked by the other gnomes.
Yeah. I love Golg.
Yeah.
He is one of my favorite characters in the Chronicles of Narnia. He's one of my favorite, very, very minor characters. But just as an aside, I just want to pause here and mention how many great, tertiary characters we have gotten in this book, from kind of the reappearance of Trumpkin for a chapter. We had Glimfeather the Owl. meeting with some of the giants, and then all the way now to Golg here. Just some of these characters that only pop up for a chapter or two, I think are some of Lewis's most enjoyable that he's ever written.
It's also funny how far away all the giants and even the owls seem.
Oh, yeah, it seems like that was so long ago that we read that.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing that Golg tells us, he tells us, by the way, I love how he just speaks for every gnome ever.
Yeah.
He's like, here's what all of us did. Everyone says to himself, right? They all kind of go through this awakening, if you will, where they all, he pretty much describes to us, alongside the rest of our heroes here, that all of the Earthmen were under a spell. They literally look down, they're like, wait, why are we carrying all these things? And they just drop them. And they realize that they, who are from a land further below where we currently are, they were under a spell here, under the witch.
Yeah, and they don't like being that close to the surface.
They do not. And this is a surprise to me, to you, to us as readers, that and just like it is to Eustace, he's like, wait, there's land still lower down? I thought we were as far as you could possibly go.
Yes, and it says 1,000 fathoms underneath us.
1,000 fathoms. That's a long way down.
Do you know how much that is in miles?
I know I don't. Have you looked it up?
I have. It's 1.13 miles, which doesn't seem as much.
No,
and
that
still,
is...
to go a mile underground would be a lot.
Yeah, that's really far down.
And I know it's fiction, but that's 1,000 fathoms sounds much more impressive.
Well, you got to remember, they're already really far below the surface in the underland. So this is even further.
It's even further. It's it adds to it.
So we learn that this world is further below them, and that, like I said, they were under this spell.
And to them, what was the crash? Is the crash the world falling apart because her spells were holding everything together?
That's what I assumed.
Yeah. Okay. I wasn't sure if there was something else that was happening too.
She has this curse on the underland that, after her death, the world's falling apart.
Yeah. Or maybe it was a really big gnome who dropped something because the spell broke on
They
him.
all were carrying stuff, yeah. Okay. Puddleglum, though, is not convinced by this story. Jill's excited that they've helped, bring freedom to these Earthmen, to these gnomes. But Puddleglum points out that they were...
Chap.
Yeah, that's right. He points out that this chap, despite what he's saying, they were all running in military formations. And what's Golg's response here?
He says that they were, but they thought that, the people coming out of the castle were going to be enemies too. They were preparing for a battle here.
Yeah, they were going to fight Puddleglum and Rillian and Eustace and Jill.
Yeah, because there's no way they're going even further up, especially not to the surface. Mm-hmm. They want to go home.
And although Puddleglum is having a harder time believe this, Rillian trusts what Golg is saying and asks Golg to lead them out into the overland. Golg, not too excited about that, but he's generous enough to point them in the right direction.
Right. But he will not join them. He says he would rather die.
And then go up there. But he does lead them on. So, and as this journey goes on, we hear that the prince has to keep telling the story of his enchantment. Do you think he enjoys telling this story over and over again, or is this making him look bad? I'm trying to decide if it's an embarrassing story for him, or if it's an enjoyable story for him to tell.
I think that it was the first time or two, but by time number 10, and he has to be sick of it.
I don't know, but I mean, he's been under a spell for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
I almost wonder just how freeing it must be just to be able to, speak for yourself, like say what you're actually thinking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
For the last 10 years, he's only been able to do this while tied to the silver chair at nighttime. Every other time he's interacted with people, it's been under the witch's enchantment.
And it's a group of people that were experiencing something similar.
Yeah.
They have empathy that are going to understand.
I like to believe that he is enjoying telling the story and is doing his best to be honest about it, but that each time he tells it, somehow it makes him look a little bit better. Like Puddleglum and Jill and Eustace, their role just diminishes just slightly each time, so that by the 10th time he's like, and then the witch turned into this snake, and and everyone stood back as I took my sword out and fought her one-on-one. It's not quite, buddy.
Yeah, I think we've all done that too. You tell a story and you just change a little detail here and there every now and then, and then you hardly even recognize the actual truth of your role.
You're like, yeah, what was the original story that was true back then? Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I've never done that because I don't ever hyperbole. I don't ever speak in hyperbole, but I've heard that
I was saying we to be nice.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, as they're continuing on and Prince Aurelian is telling his story, that's when they come to the edge of a chasm.
The sheer scale of this is pretty impressive. 1,000 feet, 200 feet wide, and then just all these gnomes climbing up, lit by fiery light. It's a nice picture.
Oh, wait, are they climbing up or climbing down?
Well, it's not clear, is it?
Why don't they all want to return to Bism?
Yeah, I think I was picturing that they had to go up a little bit to get to the part where they could then go down.
Yeah, that could be.
I do know that their goal is to go lower, and and we'll see later on they just start jumping instead of climbing down.
Yeah, but not into the Fire River. We find out that Golg said that's for salamanders, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah,
this is my favorite little section here in this chapter. It reminds me so much of, here we are at the bottom of the world. It's hard not to think of the very end of the world from the Dawn Treader. This again is a time where Lewis brings us to a great unknown. We're literally on the precipice here. We look down, and the way he describes this just seems like a place you have to go visit. You've got to be there. And this is so great because this is how Aurelian, in particular, is feeling here at the top of this chasm as he looks down. Where would you rather go? Would you rather go down into Bism, or would you prefer to go to the edge of the world, to the Silver Sea?
I don't know, man. I feel like the edge of the world would be pretty sweet. But if I was in a royal family and my father was known for going to the edge of the sea, then I think I would want to do something different.
So as all four of our companions stand here with Golg, he invites them to come down to Bism. He's like, you guys don't want to be up there on the overland. It's the what do you call it? The cold, unprotected, naked country out on top. Which is just such a great way to refer to outside.
Yeah, and then he softens it, or at least come down for a short visit.
The next time you ask me to go on a walk, I'm like, I don't want to go to the cold, unprotected, naked country on top. I want to stay inside and
you do
read a
like
book
the
on my
indoors,
couch.
don't you?
I do. Well, Aurelian surprises, to the horror of Jill, Lewis writes. He's like, I have half a mind to come down with you. He wants to go on this adventure. I mean, this was such a large theme of our last book, the idea of adventure. And here in front of us, we have a new adventure, not to the edge of the world, but down to the very bottom of it. And so it shouldn't really surprise us that Aurelian really wants to go, or at least half wants to go. He has half a mind to go. Were you surprised to hear this from him?
We don't know too much about him yet, but it does kind of line up with what we know about Caspian. There's this desire to do something big and grand and new, and he has that adventuresome spirit. Luckily, though, now's not the time for that trip. Maybe we'll get to see that later.
Right, and I think we should go ahead and just talk about Aurelian's decision, and then we can come back to describe Bism a little bit more. Aurelian decides not to travel further to the bottom of the world. And I don't know about you, Phil, but I'm a little disappointed as a reader. I'm a little disappointed because I really wanted to go down and learn more about Bism.
Luckily, we do get a little bit of a glimpse of just some of the wonders down there. And we're so deep that Golg gives us this description of our, what we would call mines. Mm-hmm. And he calls them little scratches in the crust, which is just so fun to me.
Yeah, he's like, all you guys have ever found is dead gold, dead silver, and dead gems. He's like, if you come down to Bism, we have them alive and growing.
I'll tell you, when I read this part, I just closed the book for a moment, and I thought about how fun it would be to see jewels in that state. If this were something you could really go and see, how cool that would be. We think diamonds are pretty nice now, but to be able to squeeze the juice out of a diamond, that's just such a fun thing to picture.
This is Lewis's imagination just running wild right here. And I love it because it just opens up so much beauty to us as readers. And it shows just how hard of a decision this must be for Rillian. Think back to the end of Dawn Treader. Do you remember how grumpy Caspian got in the final chapter of that book? Because he couldn't go any further. He's presented with a similar opportunity, and he almost walks away from all of his responsibility to go on an adventure. And yet, Rillian makes a different choice.
Right.
Really makes a different choice to actually say, no, I would like to go on this adventure. But instead, I know that that's not where my responsibility lies. I need to go home to my father. I need to go home. I'm the prince. And so he doesn't travel further into Bism.
Yeah. I wonder if he heard the stories of the edge of the world from his dad at any point, and if that influenced us at all.
Do you think Caspian told people about his kind of little temper tantrum he throws at the end of the world?
I would think so. I would think as he got older, maybe in the past 10 or 20 years, he probably started to try to teach some of his lessons. So the past 10 years wouldn't work, but the past 20 years might work for teaching Rillian.
I agree that he didn't tell anybody when they first got back, but as he's matured, he has started to tell that story a little bit more.
Yeah.
Well, before we leave this chasm, I also just wanted to mention the salamanders that swim in the river of fire. Now, Phil, I don't know how familiar you are with the role that salamanders have often played in folklore, but they are usually associated with fire.
Really?
Yeah, they are. We see, I went back and I was doing a little bit of reading, and I'm familiar with some of this just in my kind of day job here. But here's just a couple of the names of people in the West who have written about salamanders at one point or another, and their association with fire.
J.K. Rowling.
You might...
Newt Salamander, next one.
Is that really his name?
Isn't there a Newt Salamander?
I think it's like Scamander, isn't it? I don't think it's Salamander.
Yeah, it's Scamander.
Newt Salamander. Those movies are awful, so that's fine. I have no interest in ever watching any more of those.
But you will.
I don't know, man. That second one was really, really bad. So no, Harry Potter's not what I'm thinking of here. So we've got Pliny the Elder from the 1st century. We've got St. Augustine, who writes in the City of God, and then one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles himself, Leonardo da Vinci. There was
loved him in Titanic.
It's in one of the kind of compilation of some of his writings. There's one called The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. He writes about how they get their food from the fire and they use it to renew its scaly skin. So throughout kind of Western folklore, we see salamanders often associated with fire. And obviously we know that that isn't necessarily true about, actual salamanders, but this was an association they had for a long time. And so Lewis is clearly drawing upon that here. Again, finding ways to kind of use all different kinds of mythology in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah, that's really fun.
So any other thoughts on Bism, Phil, before we leave here and continue on?
I don't know. I don't. This is kind of, we're at the end of our... end of the knowledge that we came with before starting this podcast in terms of what happens in the books. I know you've read at least 2 others, but I would love to see more about Bism. I don't know if we'll get that, but I know right now that I have the desire to learn more about this land, and I hope we'll at least hear of someone getting to go there, or it'll be referenced later. Yeah. So who knows what'll happen, but it sounds like a fun place to learn about.
Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to say about Bism is that I wonder how readers, especially children reading this, I wonder how many people are afraid that when they look over the chasm, they're going to see into hell. That's never come up at all in the Chronicles of Narnia, but I mean, it's hard not to think about just some imagery of like, oh wait, they're going down into a fiery place below the earth. Like, there is that connection to be
there
made.
Are multiple levels.
Yeah, so now we're getting into Dante, right? And I didn't think of that at all, only because I'm familiar enough with this book that it just, of course it's Bism. But I do wonder if there's any, children when they first read this are like, wait, what's going to be below there? And instead Lewis kind of subverts our expectations, and it's this really beautiful thing instead of this, awful place.
Right.
All right, but leaving Bism behind, just as Rillian and his companions do, we're going to continue ascending further up and no, wait, that's not what this is. We are going to go.
I was
further
hopeful
up,
for a second.
You think you thought it was going to show up?
Yeah, it turned out they were just going further down and to the left. I'm going to send all my emails like that for the next month.
Further down and to the left?
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this, because all of the gnomes start jumping down into the chasm. I definitely have images of the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where that giant opening in the earth comes out. Do you remember this?
I don't know if I've seen that one, actually.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I think I've seen Raiders a few times, but not the others.
Wait, how have you not? You've seen like Star Wars 1 billion times, but you haven't watched all the Indiana Jones movies?
I'm busy watching Star Wars over and over again.
Well,
we'll get in the fridge and we'll watch the rest of them.
So how do you know that reference if...
Because that's pop culture. I also know that the fawns jumped over a shark, but I never watched Happy Days.
Fair enough. I have watched that clip, but I don't think I've ever seen a full episode of Happy Days. So.
Yeah. They referenced it in Arrested Development. Did you see that?
Well, yeah, because that Ron Howard is the narrator for Arrested Development.
And
Henry Winkler's in it.
Henry Winkler jumps over a shark.
I forgot that he actually does that in the... Well, let's get back to Narnia here. And as this happens, it's time for Golg to say goodbye to the rest of our characters here, and then he himself goes down to the land of Bism. It completely closes up at like the shock, like 1,000 good trains crashing into 1,000 pairs of buffers.
Hold on real quick. I have a question about the sentence before that.
Okay.
Do you know what a pillar box is?
No. What is a pillar box?
A pillar box is similar to a USPS drop-off box.
Oh, really?
The blue containers?
Yeah.
But theirs are red.
Oh, okay.
And they have a slot that you could put a few envelopes in at a time.
So a really small... Okay, now that makes sense then.
Yeah. And then it becomes the size of a thread, and then it's completely closed.
Oh, nice. I like that description. That actually really helped me with the imagery here.
And what I'm curious about is this a commonly known thing today in 2021, or is this like kind of an outdated reference? Do they refer to mailboxes as something else? I wouldn't know.
I don't know. Maybe one of our listeners from the UK can let us know.
Yeah.
Well, then the opening is completely closed, and it's time to move on. Puddleglum's worried that they probably have stayed a little too long, and the lamps are all going to give out in 5 minutes. He shouldn't wonder, which has really quickly become his catchphrase, and I quite enjoy that.
Yeah. It's his old sport.
Yeah. So they now go ahead and they move forward, and as they're going down into a valley, they see a lot of moving water. I've already mentioned before that the idea of water underground is something I really don't like, and yet the 2 horses carrying our 4 travelers have to go across what is about a foot or 2 of water. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's moving water, too. Lewis writes that he says something along the lines of, if it had just been a little bit higher, the horses probably wouldn't have been able to swim because of the speed at which the water was moving. This is not just like standing water there. This is a river, right? Or a stream, I guess.
Right.
The water is rising, but their path is illuminated. What's happening here?
Well, there are all these lamps, at least for now.
Mm-hmm.
And they're lighting the way that they're under the impression they should go.
Right, they can see the path ahead of them kind of sloping upwards, and they're assuming this is the way to go. Right, they were worried that potentially Golg had maybe even pointed them in the wrong direction, but they can see far off that it is sloping upwards quite high. And so they continue on this path. But it's getting really narrow, and it eventually the roof is so low that Rillian and Puddleglum, they have to bend down. So remember, we talked about this last time, that we made the joke about them all having to crab walk inside of the Underland, and here actually it's getting to a place where they are having trouble standing up. And as they are worried about what is to come, please tell us what Puddleglum says, Phil.
This is one of the greatest Puddleglum quotes, and he has quite a few, so this is something to be at the top of the list. And Rillian has just said, "Whether we live or die, Aslan will be our good lord." And Puddleglum agrees. He says, "That's right, sir." But he also says, "And you must always remember there's one good thing about being trapped down here. It'll save funeral expenses." And that's immediately followed with, "Jill held her tongue." And you think it's going to be about that, but it's actually she's trying to be quiet because she doesn't want people to know how afraid she is.
How terrified she is. Yeah, I mean, it is terrifying. They're getting to a point where they're not sure how they're going to be able to get out here. That is until they see something surprising. They see light up ahead at what looks to be a dead end, but it's not daylight. Jill points out that it's kind of a cold blue sort of light. And this is where the chapter ends. They approach it, and Jill's going to get on top of Puddleglum's shoulders to get a closer look, and then right in the middle of this conversation, the chapter abruptly ends.
Yeah, commercial break.
Exactly. The screen fades to black. The words "lost" shows up on the screen, and we're left.
And the credits roll.
Phil, for your prediction here, what do you think this cold blue light is?
It makes me think that it is light from the outside world, but it's at nighttime.
Okay, so this is daylight that we're seeing here.
Yeah, or maybe they've stumbled upon a cache of sapphires. Who knows?
Okay. But you think we are at the end of the road, literally. We're about to break through into the overland.
That's my hope, yes.
Okay, cool. Well, any last thoughts before we finish up this chapter here?
Well, the way my book is structured, I can see the illustration on the next page. There's no avoiding it. And I see an illustration of an owl. I don't know how your book is formatted, but there's a bear and an owl and then a bunch of gnomes with picks. And I think even a platypus. I'm just so curious what's going to happen. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, the next chapter, Phil, is called The Disappearance of Jill. And in that chapter, the four travelers attempt to return to the surface. Also, Jill disappears.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, as always, we do have some listener feedback to get to. We have an email today from Hannah Brisby. Hannah's written into the show before. She's got a great connection for us today.
So Hannah writes, "One of the biggest connections I made recently was about how Aslan's quest for Jill and Eustace reminds me of the Great Commission we read about in the Gospels. Jesus tells his disciples in various ways to go out and preach the good news to all people. In Matthew specifically, he tells his disciples that they need to go to all nations and teach them to obey everything he has commanded them. He tells them that he will be with them always until the end of the age, and then ascends into heaven to be at the right hand of the Father. He is no longer physically on earth with them, but he gave them this lifelong task that would prove to be very dangerous, leading to persecution, imprisonment, beatings, and martyrdom. By no means was this an easy task that Jesus gave his followers, but they did as he commanded. His disciples went out and proclaimed the good news, knowing that they were doing and what it could lead to. In comparison, Aslan tells Jill that they have been called into this world to do this task of rescuing Prince Rillian and giving her signs to look for to help them with their journey. He warns her that many strange things will happen to distract her from the signs, and that he will not appear to her so clearly once she is in Narnia. He tells her to hold tight to the signs, and that they will not look like what she expects them to. He then blows her into Narnia, and we do not hear from him again until Puddleglum, Jill, and Eustace are trapped in Harfang. Aslan is not physically there with them, but he has given them this task and ways in which they can succeed. They need to cling to the signs and constantly be looking for them in ways they might not expect. Their task is dangerous, and they face many trials, and Aslan is not physically there to help them and guide them, but they do keep going with the quest that they were given. This connection helps me understand as well why Aslan feels so distant in this book. In both The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian, Aslan appears and stays with the children for long stretches of time. In Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he was only physically with them twice, I'm including the albatross, but he feels as though he's on the ship with them and journeys to the different islands alongside the crew. In The Silver Chair, however, it does not feel this way. While he does appear to Jill in the very first chapter, up until Harfang he feels very far away, and I think this is purposeful. The group gets distracted and focused on the worldly feelings and wants. They forget to look for the signs in the face of suffering and trials. It's easy to notice in a book where you're not feeling the biting cold, the weariness from traveling on foot, and the lack of good and restful sleep. In your own life, certainly in my own, the distraction of worldly wants and suffering can cause us to lose focus on what Jesus has called us to do. He has called us to go and make disciples of all nations, and while he is no longer here on earth with us physically anymore, the Holy Spirit dwells in those who have recognized their sinfulness and trusted their eternal salvation on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. P.S. Daniel, your pronunciation of wolf has gotten a lot better. I appreciate your dedication to the task of relearning how to say a word you have not been pronouncing a certain way all your life. I hope that I have not made you too self-conscious about all your other pronunciation. You really have worked on it a lot.
With the word wolf, yeah. I think with other stuff, I am more just like, you know what? I'm already I'm already committed to other words I say, and some of it I think is just accents or just kind of other things. But wolf is one thing that I have worked on. I said it right that time. Don't laugh at me.
Yeah.
But Hannah was the first person who pointed that out, so I do. That's always a fun thing. But let's go back to the incredible words that she brought, preaching on the show here via email. I love what Hannah is saying here. It's so great when we get to read this book with all of our listeners. We're going through this book all together because, I have really only been thinking about Aslan's charge to Jill as more of the supposal of God giving the law to the Israelites. Obviously, that is from the Old Testament, and yet here, Hannah is making a connection with the New Testament, with the Gospels. And it's something I had not thought about at all since we began this book, and here we are near its end. And it's something that I think really does fit into a reading of this text, to look at it this way and make these connections. I mean, there's almost not that much to add to what Hannah said because she said it so eloquently.
Yeah, really fantastic points. And this is part of what I love about doing this show is we hadn't thought of this in this way. And now we have such a clear example, and we get to take that example and share it with our listeners, our other listeners too. This is really well done.
Yeah, so Hannah, thanks so much for illuminating us with this really wonderful connection you've made. I think it's a great way to see Aslan's role in this book, which has felt distant. I mean, we haven't talked about Aslan really since we saw him like Hannah said, we saw him in Harfang, but again, he wasn't physically there. He hasn't been in this book since chapter 2. Yeah. And that's been a bump. And even before that, we didn't see him a ton in Dawn Treader. So we really haven't spent much time with Aslan since Caspian. And I think some of us might be lamenting that. But in that, we now have a good reason, or a great way to read this as one of the reasons why we haven't seen Aslan in a while.
Right. And just it's another, point or another thing that Lewis does so well where he's varying how Aslan works with people book by book. It's not the same thing every time. That would get old pretty fast. But this is just because the Lord works in mysterious ways, and he works in different ways at different times in our lives. And it's fun to see like a different way of this kind of metaphor for all that working its way out here.
Yeah, it does show us kind of the diversity in Aslan's character and personality in the way that he interacts with the Narnians.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, any final thoughts before we wrap up this episode of the show?
I'm just looking forward to these next 2 chapters.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be really fun. We've got some guests going to be joining us for our final 2 chapters, and we're going to be diving into the end of this book, which is hard to believe it's already here.
Right.
Well, as we do at the end of each episode, we need to acknowledge that this episode could not be made without the helpful support of our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to join them and support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. As always, we want to give special thanks to Elias Dean, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, Emily Margaret, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. You can follow us into Narnia on our social media pages, and if you have any feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. As always, we appreciate a review over on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app so that you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Well, thank you for coming along on this journey. We'll be back next time with Chapter 15.